My guest today is a decorated war hero. He was the senior advisor to the United States Secretary of Defense. He led tanks in Desert Storm, and today he leads the charge against failed foreign policy. He is Washington's harshest critic and simultaneously the loudest advocate for military reform. His name is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and today we go deep. We talk about Iran and the future of power in the Middle East. We talk about the incentives behind Israeli and United States cooperation. And we talk about the deep ties between Mossad, the CIA, Jeffrey Epstein, and much more. Buckle up. Here's the Colonel on the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. Colonel, thank you so much for coming back on the program today.
Happy to be here, Jay.
So here's where I want to start, sort of open-ended question, and then I'm going to pull on some threads. I need to get your perspective on the events over the weekend. The United States launched a formal strike against Iran, targeting nuclear facilities. It's quite an escalation, or some people would see it that way. I'd love to get your take on that situation, the impact and consequence, and then we'll go from there.
Well, I think it's important for your listeners in Canada and the United States to know something. Many do, but there are still a lot of people who don't know it. That certainly since the mid-1990s, the State of Israel, its leadership, as well as its lobby and agents in the United States, have worked tirelessly, and I mean tirelessly, and spent an enormous amount of money on the Hill to ultimately drag the United States into the Middle East and help wage this war against Iran. And for that matter, everyone and anyone Israel regards as a threat or dislikes. So this was coming for a long time. What's interesting is that President Trump is the first president who finally submitted to the pressure. Now, what's he done? And that's an important question. He's effectively started a war that involves the United States against Iran on behalf of the State of Israel. Now, some people would say, well, that's not really true. For instance, Vice President J.D. Vance insists, well, we're at war with Iran's nuclear capacity. That's sort of like saying that, Jay, I'm at war with the chair you're sitting in because I don't like it. That doesn't make any sense. But I think J.D. Vance is trying to put a happy face on a dead rat. So we're very definitely now at war. On the other hand, this certainly was a very strange event. It turns out that the Iranians did not turn on any radars, to be frank. They didn't fire any missiles. In other words, there was no air and missile defense capability in evidence. And I think that may be because we called and let them know a couple of hours ahead of time, presumably through Swiss contacts, that we were going to strike three sites. These three sites, Fodor was one, Natanz, and the third one that we allegedly had identified as sites where Iran was developing nuclear power, presumably enriching uranium, and could potentially build a bomb. Well, it turns out that we dropped lots of ordnance on these things. We don't seem to have had much impact. We don't seem to have killed anybody. There doesn't seem to have been much in these places. In other words, it's the equivalent of blowing up empty buildings. So the real question now is, what's next? And I think the Israelis are going to attack these sites again, but one wonders what's the rationale. We found that, for instance, in Fodor, this was the mountain fortress where these uranium enrichment facilities were supposed to be located deep underground, that the Iranians had been filling the tunnels with earth. In other words, closing it off. And they'd been doing that for some time. So I think something's changed. The intelligence was either not very good, or deliberately we did not seek out and try to destroy anything of any real value. I don't know which is true. You can only know that by understanding the discussions inside the government. And of course, also having access to some real hard intelligence and satellite photography. But the battle damage assessment, for whatever it's worth, that we can now view on YouTube in terms of satellite imagery, tell us we didn't do much. I compared this into an X article that I wrote to another Pearl Harbor operation. The Japanese steamed towards Pearl Harbor. They launched airstrikes. They sank some battleships, did damage to the Pearl Harbor port that the Navy used. Then they flew away and the ships sailed away. And they all expected us to, at that point, capitulate. In fact, the expectation from Emperor Hirohito at the time, he said, this has been a great success. And now what we really want is peace. That's almost word for word what Donald Trump said. And of course, we all know what we got after Pearl Harbor. And I think we should be prepared for something similar with the Iranians at some point in time. But the Iranians are not reckless. They're not impetuous. They're not emotional. They don't react quickly. They react in a very sober-minded and calculated manner. So I think we're going to have to wait and see what they do. They have lots of options that they can employ against us. In the meantime, we have thousands of sailors floating around the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean. I'm happy that I'm not there. I wouldn't want to be stuck out there for months at a time, but I guess that's where they're going to sit. We still have a lot of people on the ground in Iraq and Syria and Jordan. We did evacuate Bahrain. So, we'll have to wait and see what the Iranians decide to do. Meanwhile, Israel was badly hammered last night. And hundreds of missiles were fired, and most of them seem to have gotten through and done enormous damage. Of course, if you turn to the Israelis, they will say, oh, no real damage. Everything's just fine. Well, we've got 700,000 Israelis who apparently hold American passports as well as Israeli passports who are trying to leave the country. And we don't know how many other thousands, tens of thousands or more Israelis have already left. And suddenly it's being circulated that Prime Minister Netanyahu is approaching the Iranians through third countries saying that he wants to stop the war. Of course, the Iranians have answered, stop the war. You shouldn't have started a war that you didn't know how to stop when you began this process. The Iranians are not going to stop anything. So right now we're staring at a war with uncertain ramifications and the potential to widen and do more damage. Not a good thing. And by the way, just on here, I was told that the Straits of Hormuz would be formally closed in the next 2 or 3 hours. And that's not by seeking anything. That's simply saying, don't approach the straits from inside the Persian Gulf and don't approach them from outside because you risk being sunk. And the Iranians ultimately don't have to do much because the insurance companies will do the rest. They will, frankly, not insure tankers that are going to go in or out of the Persian Gulf, and that'll do more to stop the flow of oil coming out of the Gulf than anything else. So I think that's where we're headed.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I want to chat about the Strait of Hormuz a little bit with you in a minute because, the way I see it there, Iran doesn't have to do anything. They can just threaten. And as you mentioned, the insurance companies will do the rest. No companies are going to float oil through that strait under those conditions. But back to something you said, you discussed Operation Midnight Hammer as maybe being one of two things. The first being poor intelligence. Maybe we struck sites that used to be relevant but are no longer relevant because the intelligence was poor. That's why it looks like there's no body count, there was no defense activated, and hardly any destruction occurred. But the second was that almost you referenced this was sort of like the impression of an attack for the impression's sake. I want to run through that scenario a little bit more and understand it better. If that was the goal was to create the appearance of a strike on something significant, but not actually do any damage, just publicity. What's the rationale and incentive behind that strategy, do you think?
To understand that possibility and regarding its plausibility, you've got to go back to President Trump's first term. During his first term, he launched cruise missile strikes against targets in Syria. And this was in response to an alleged chemical attack or nerve gas attack or something against people in Syria. Of course, that turned out to be a lie. They were not attacked by, the Assad regime or anything else. And the so-called white helmets who went in there were prompted to do so and supported by MI6 in London, trying to create the illusion of something bad that would then provoke the United States to go into Syria, into the war. Remember, they tried this earlier with Barack Obama. President Obama was ready to launch strikes into Syria because the objective then was to destroy the Assad regime. This was always the Israeli Netanyahu plan, destroy Assad, even though many of us at the time continued to say over and over and over again, look, what are you going to replace Assad with? It's probably going to be some worse Islamist government that will then threaten Israel. But nobody seemed to be interested in that. And now we do have what is effectively an Islamist government. Former deputy head of ISIS is the new reigning president, and they are slaughtering Christians and other minorities on a pretty routine basis. Nobody seems to care. And the Turks and the Israelis seem to have come to some sort of Nazi Soviet style pact where they don't interfere with each other, that the Israelis can control most of southern Syria up to Damascus, and the Turks are effectively in control of everything in Damascus and north. So that has to be understood. Now, then come subsequently, while President Trump is in office, you get these strikes. All of those cruise missile strikes had happened twice. I think it was 2017 and 2018. On both occasions, those missile strikes went into the sand. They hit nothing of value. They were purely symbolic. And we called the Russians in advance and told them this is what we wanted to do. We explained it. We told them what the targets were, and Mr. Putin said fine. And he shut down the Russian and Syrian air defenses and radars so that we could launch these missiles and be done with it. Did it twice. So I think we've had something similar potentially happen in Iran, but I don't know. You can't know that unless you're on the inside. So the two possibilities that you mentioned are still plausible. One, that we didn't know what we were doing, or we thought we were doing something, and it turns out we were not. And the other is it was another demonstration, symbolic, empty. We don't know. But in any case, the Iranians regard this as an act of war, which leads me to believe that it's probably closer to the first than it is to the second. But nevertheless, that's where we are now. And we have begun a war with Iran.
Okay. So it sounds like there's a higher probability from your perspective that this was an issue of poor intelligence than some kind of a head fake maneuver. Okay. So let me ask you, when I look at this region, I try to step back from the near term conflict, and I got friends in Tehran and I got friends in Tel Aviv, and it's heartbreaking. And there's this emotional investment all the time. So as best I can, I try to step back and just look at the conflict through the lens of trade. And I say, what are the economics behind this region? What matters, right? And Strait of Hormuz, obviously the most important item. Iran's southern shore controls 20 to 25% of global oil flow. And they just have to threaten violence, and they shut that flow off, which is catastrophic for Europe, for most of the world. Instant inflation spike, all of this stuff. Also, Iran has probably the second or third largest oil reserves and second or third largest gas reserves in the world. And kind of tough to measure because it's sort of undeveloped, but they're up there competing for the top 2 or 3 spot in the world. And so you could say this conflict is as simple potentially as that. There's massive resource wealth inside these borders, and the United States wants it. And it's the same movie we've seen on repeat many, many times. Is that an oversimplification when we hear the talk of regime change? It means we want a regime more allied with Western interests, and therefore we can get access to those resources in a better way. What's your take, Colonel?
Well, it would be foolish to assume that the financial interests in New York City and the City of London banks are not connected to this. First of all, Europe is on the ropes. They don't have access to cheap Russian oil and gas any longer. In the case of Germany, they've actually deindustrialized themselves, committed economic suicide, and they seem to be on that track without getting off of it anytime soon. We are trying to sell them whatever we produce, liquefied natural gas, oil, and so forth. They're also paying very, very much for the same substance, oil, coming via India and moving through India and up through Turkey and into Europe and elsewhere. Why? Well, it's because the Russians are selling oil and natural gas, but primarily oil in great quantities to the Indians at very cheap prices. The Indians can actually refine it. They have one of the largest refineries in the world, which happens to be owned by a Russian firm. This is then moved through various places up into Europe. And of course, the price the Europeans are paying for it is infinitely higher than what the Indians would pay. I mean, it's kind of a self-degradation game if you're a European right now. In order to satisfy the globalists that run the countryside, satisfy U.S. interests, you are shooting yourself in the foot and you're destroying your economy. At some point, I think they'll wake up, but for the moment, they still are stuck with the same ruling political class. What does this mean for us and the Europeans? Again, the city of London, New York City, Washington would like to control those oil fields that are down in the Middle East. There's no question about it. They would like to go in there and get control of them. They're desperate to put a new regime into power that will be a puppet regime. This, of course, is why people have been listening to this so-called crown prince of Iran, the son of the Shah. And he's widely regarded as a traitor to the Iranian people. And I don't see any evidence whatsoever that they could place him there and in any time soon and get anywhere. But I think all of these kinds of things, these are plans that are being hatched in London, New York City, and Washington to try and bomb, ultimately, Iran into submission. They're trying to supply the Israelis with everything the Israelis need in order to do that. But that's obviously not working. It's going to take a lot more damage and a lot more destruction. The problem is that once you go down that route and you try to do more destruction, you run the risk of losing aircraft. You run the risk of being embroiled in fighting that will cost you potentially capital ships. And then, of course, there is Russia and there's China, as well as the rest of the Muslim world. I mean, the Pakistanis have come online. Everybody acts as though that's very surprising. But, of course, Pakistan has standing behind it China, and no doubt China is promising to support Pakistan. India is running silent. Everybody forgets that India is probably the largest Muslim country in the world. They have more Muslim Indian citizens than Pakistan does. So you've got a strange phenomenon. The entire world, minus the United States, and I would argue Western Europe, is lining up against us. And that's not a good thing. And so if I were going to make a long-term prediction right now, I would say that when this ends, and I don't know when that will be, this could go on for months, or as the Iranians recently pointed out, they're prepared for a 2-year war or more. I mean, these things could go on much longer, unless, of course, someone uses a nuclear weapon. And the people with the nuclear weapons are the Israelis. And one of the great fears we've always had is that the Israelis would threaten the use of a nuclear weapon, and that threat would come to us in the United States if they didn't get what they want. And what they're fighting for is effectively supremacy in the entire region. In other words, Israeli hegemony, which, of course, is the face of this effort in the West by the United States, by New York City and London banks to take over these oil fields. I mean, why else would you fight there? There's nothing else to have, unless you like pistachio nuts, but I think we have a lot of pistachio nuts and rugs. So you are absolutely right. That's at the heart of this whole thing. And Russia, of course, looks down at Iran, not only as an ally, which it is an ally, but that's the soft underbelly of Russia. That's the Caucasus and Central Asia. Those areas must be stable. If those are destabilized and Iran should fall apart, and God forbid a puppet government along the lines I discussed earlier should take power in that country, we can't know what would happen. There are also people that are talking privately on the sidelines about breaking up and fragmenting Iran. So if you look at the people that are driving this in the United States and London, I'm talking about the individual personalities and the political figures, the financial figures behind the scenes. They're the same people who have been trying to destroy Russia, because the goal was always the removal of Putin, the destruction of the Russian state, and then an opportunity to go in and rape Russia for all of its resources. So we're dealing with the same thing. That attempt has failed. The war in Ukraine is a failure. It's cost us enormous amounts of money, tremendous amounts of equipment. It's over. Is this going to end on whatever terms Russia decides to impose? We're out. And you can watch carefully as when Trump talks. What's he say? Well, they have to fight it amongst themselves. I did all I could. I should get the Nobel Peace Prize for all that I've done. I mean, laughable statements after all the stupid statements he made beforehand. So I could end it in 24 hours. I could pick up the phone and I could force these two people to the table. Stupid people that know nothing in the West believe that nonsense. Nobody understood the complexities. Nobody understood what Putin was doing. Nobody understood what we were really doing. We didn't give a damn about the Ukrainians. They were a useful battering ram. So now you have a similar situation in the Middle East. Only the difference is that Israel is at the center of this as a state that wants to control the region, but represents far more than the few million people that live in it. Remember, Israel is connected to the diaspora that lives all over the world. And that diaspora controls enormous amounts of wealth, all of which have been employed to bring the United States to this point.
Let me ask you a question here, Colonel. So we've been covering the sort of the weapons manufacturing industry in the United States over the last couple of weeks. And American bulls would say that despite everything you shared, that we're making adversaries all over the world, we're breaking up alliances, our trade aggression is having the opposite effect, all of this stuff. The United States still has this massive ace in their back pocket, which is the most advanced weaponry in the world. And my pushback to that has been, well, that may be the case, but they can't build a single piece of military equipment without either processed rare earths from China or even nickel, which 61% of which comes from Indonesia, built by Chinese infrastructure. You can go down the list of commodities required, and every time you'll find that either they're sourced or processed in Eastern allied economies. And so, what good is an advanced weapon if you can't build it without your enemy's inputs, right? It doesn't make any sense. Massive leverage is what the Chinese has over the rare earth processing sector. Massive leverage. So one scenario we looked at was maybe that is what the United States is seeking with the Strait of Hormuz, because they need some kind of comparable leverage over the global economy. Right now, Iran has that leverage over the Strait, and Iran supplies, even though they're sanctioned, their oil industry is sanctioned. They ship 1.7 million barrels per day to China via their dark fleet. They're received by China's teapot refineries, these little independent refineries that can, I guess have plausible deniability that they're buying illegal oil. Anyways, over 50% of China's oil is bought at a steep discount from Iran because they're the only buyer of Iranian oil. And so by destabilizing the Iranian regime, you sort of knock down two goals at once. Number one, you massively disrupt China's energy supply. They no longer have access to this incredibly cheap oil, which is often like $3 to $11 less per barrel than what we pay. And secondly, you get the leverage over the Strait of Hormuz for yourself. And now you have an answer to China's export restrictions on rare earths. They say, we'll just stop selling and you're done. Well, now the U.S. can say, between our domestic supply and the Gulf states, we run the oil globally. There's nothing. So is there like a grander strategy there? Or do you think we're overthinking this and putting way too much credit on the in the minds of the decision makers? What do you think?
No, I think you're right. And I can give you some details. If you go back into the 1990s, there was a study prepared that was led by Richard Pearl and Dr. Paul Wolfowitz, included others whose names are well known, neocons, Zionists. And they effectively advocated a strategy that would secure control of the Middle East for its oil and gas resources as a way to harm China and ultimately to employ that against China in the future. So that is in the background. There's no question about it. The problem with these kinds of things is this is a very complex world. And while China very definitely wants that oil and natural gas, there are multiple ways to get it. One of the reasons the One Belt, One Road project began all across Central Asia that reaches all the way down into Iran, down to the southern portion of Iran, and then back up into Central Asia through Russia and Ukraine into Europe. All of that was designed to circumvent an organization called the United States Navy. Everybody knows that the United States Navy is in a position to blockade Chinese ports. No question about it. Now, you don't need to say that to have an impact. And by the way, that doesn't have much to do with surface ships. 5 or 6 nuclear submarines, attack subs, can do the job. Right. So this is not that difficult to do. Obviously, we don't want a direct confrontation with China. We would rather capture, the chessboard and then say, these are the things we want you to do. That's very dangerous because now Russia can supply China with a great deal of what it needs. Right now, Russia, for instance, for the first time in decades, is selling great quantities of oil and natural gas to Japan. And we approached the Japanese government and said, but you're with us. You're failing to impose the effective embargo that we have on Russia. And so the Japanese have said, thank you very much. We're not interested. The other thing that's happening, of course, is the financial system. And we are in a very, very fragile state. We don't know what's going to happen in the derivative markets. We don't know what will happen in the bond markets. Everything could collapse very, very quickly. And as our friend Nassim Taleb likes to tell everybody, gold is now the reserve currency. So, it's not as though we are a strong and powerful entity as we once were. This is not 1991. Frankly, it's not even 1941, because in those days, we were a huge manufacturing power. And we were essentially self-sufficient in most important ways. We've given a lot of that up, and we live or enjoy a standard of living that is far beyond our means as a result of the mismanagement of our financial system and the spending of money and so forth. So you're right, but it's not a clear-cut outcome. And there's always the chance that somebody finally says, Washington, that's enough. And they decide to fight. Thus far, I would argue that the guiding imperative for the Russian strategic operations in Ukraine has been to avoid confrontation with the United States. Putin has bent over backwards to do everything he can to avoid a war with us. He doesn't want a war with us. Neither does China. If you go to Asia, the only people in Asia talking about a war are Americans. The Vietnamese are not afraid of a Chinese invasion. The last time that happened was 1979. That didn't work very well. And this business about Taiwan, the Chinese on Taiwan and the Chinese on the mainland both want the same thing. They both want to look like Singapore. And they're not going to go to war with each other. In fact, if anything, I think that Taiwan will vote itself into China once it comes to an agreement with the mainland on how that looks and what that will entail. No one's interested in a war. The Japanese certainly aren't. Neither are the Koreans. The Koreans are looking at us and beginning to say, perhaps it's time for the Americans to leave because we're seen as a catalyst for conflict. Nobody in South Korea is afraid of China. Now, everyone respects China's economic power, the size of its population. Absolutely. But they're not worried about a military conflict. And the Chinese don't want one. So we're back to the original proposition. If we can gain control of the oil fields and the natural gas fields, we control the Persian Gulf, then we have China by the throat. I don't think so. I think we're a long way from that. And in fact, to go forward with some prognostication, I think the entire Arab world right now is violently anti-Israeli. And I don't think the family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, or, for instance, someone like King Abdullah in Jordan, and even potentially the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, are going to survive this current crisis. They may well be removed. And if you're sitting in Iran, and you know this, you know that all of these populations are violently anti-Israeli. In other words, they want to go to war. They've listened to the Israelis tell them they're subhuman. They've watched the Israelis murder thousands and thousands of people in Gaza, the West Bank, southern Lebanon. They are furious. They want blood. This is true certainly for Egypt. Sisi's biggest challenge in Egypt is keeping the Egyptian military from just attacking Israel. So if you understand this, what would you do as an Iranian? Well, I certainly would probably do everything in my power to put those emirates out of business. And that would not be very difficult. You hit the desalination plants, they run out of water.
Right.
You don't
Okay.
let ships take out oil, they can't make money. And the populations are already fed up because they refuse to stand up and be counted in solidarity with the people of Palestine. What will happen in Israel? How many desalination plants do they have? How much longer do the Iranians wait to destroy those? It doesn't take long in that part of the world to run out of water. And I've been there many times. And if you run out of water, it just doesn't make any difference what else you do.
Of course. You know what? That's fascinating. And quite honestly, Colonel, an angle that I haven't really thought much about. You know, I tend to obsess over the supply and demand of raw materials and who has this and who wants that, and therefore who's got leverage and all of this, and get to the incentives that way. The desalination plants are really interesting because as soon as you said, you know, the Kingdom of Jordan, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, you know, these are vulnerable states right now. Immediately I thought, how? Like, what is the angle there? And I looked at the American president's recent trip to United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia as effectively, you know, and some of the deals that came out of that, not the superficial, here's an airplane deal, but like Ma'aden and MP Materials, Ma'aden being the Saudi Arabian rare earth mining company, and MP Materials being the American, struck a memorandum of understanding to build full supply chain rare earth processing inside the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And it struck me as advantageous because I thought, the U.S. can make noise about reshoring some of these industries, but they don't have the political will to get any of that done. I mean, these are like decade-long projects, multi-billion dollars. And in the case of mineral processing, they come with a tremendous amount of environmental concessions that have to be made. And Americans just aren't going to do that. But if you can borrow that political will in a kingdom like Saudi Arabia, who doesn't have to worry about public sentiment and elections and things like this, that's the perfect ally for a democracy like America. And I thought, this is the partnership that America needs right
now. Did you call us a democracy again? I'm shocked. You know, I certainly do not. I mean, there was no debate, no discussion. The Constitution outlines in great detail what is supposed to happen. Nothing has, because ultimately Mr. Netanyahu owns the Congress and the White House. And if you sit down President Trump and say, how many senators do you control on a particular vote, and how many does Mr. Netanyahu control on a vote? Mr. Netanyahu wins hands down every time. So I think that's one problem. Here's something else, though, for you to consider. An awful lot of that that was agreed in Saudi Arabia could change overnight. The Saudis are very frustrated with us on a number of different fronts, not the least of which is financial. What happens if they, along with the Chinese and the Japanese, as major bondholders of the United States, decide to dump their bonds? I mean, after all, this thing called the U.S. dollar continues to weaken and weaken. How much longer do they trade in it? Right now, the Chinese and the Japanese trade in their own currency. We're seeing more and more of that. So I think the dollar is not just weakening. I think we're seeing massive de-dollarization. And all that President Trump did with his tariff escapade was accelerate that process, because he did not present a targeted tariff strategy. He just tariffed everybody, which was stupid. He also didn't take the time and the trouble to be polite and go to the Chinese and say, you know, this dollar thing is not working very well for us. We need your help. We would like to cooperate with you. Can't we work through this? The Chinese would have been happy to help us. Not anymore. The Chinese are offended. You just had the Vice President of the United States declare them a country of peasants. You know, this is absurd. And Trump has treated everyone as though everyone has the obligation to bend down to Israel and the United States. That's not going to happen. Again, this is not 1991. So I think there's something else, too. You mentioned rare earths. Let me give you an example of something nobody ever brings up and talks about. First of all, we do need to build a rare earth refinery in North America. We should have one in the United States. given the distribution of where the rare earth potential is, we can pick the right spot, make sure it has plenty of connectivity, rail, air, and so forth. We can do that. There just hasn't been the will to do it. But I think now that is eminently possible because I've been talking to people about it, and there is a change of heart on the Hill. They realize how serious this is. Secondly, Norway just discovered what is arguably the largest deposit of rare earths in all of Europe, maybe Europe and Central Asia. It's just offshore, and it's down in a few hundred feet of water, which is ideal. You're not talking about something that's 1,000 feet down or 2,000 feet down, which is the problem the Japanese face. They've got rare earths on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The question is, how do you build a refinery on the bottom of the ocean? Because if you start dredging to bring that stuff up, how many tons do you bring up and how many pounds of rare earths do you get as a result? So Norway is in a very favorable position right now. And if I were on the Hill, I would be much more sensitive to Norway's opportunity, and I would be working with the Norwegians. By the way, I think Canada should do the same thing. You have rare earths. It's a matter of exploiting them and refining them. We should be working with you to do that. And particularly given the isolation, I think the United States is going to suffer in the future because nobody will trust us. Nobody will believe anything we say. We really, really, really need to build our own capability right here at home. But I wouldn't bet too heavily on everything that was discussed during the president's trip. I would hold fire. I would watch carefully, see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense to me. I have to pull on a thread. One statement you made here that, quite honestly, I still don't understand, but you said Netanyahu still controls a larger percentage of Congress than the White House, more congressmen, more senators than the president of the United States himself. Why is that? If I were to just ask you simply, why does Israel have so much influence on the United States? What would you tell me?
Money. First of all, remember, did you see the discussion between Senator Cruz and Tucker Carlson?
I did.
All right. Do you realize that Senator Cruz, as a senator, over the last few years has received, according to some estimates, $1.8 million from the Israel lobby? Now, how do you get that money? By voting the way the Israel lobby tells you to vote. Now, the argument is the Israel lobby is not a foreign lobby because most of the money comes from wealthy Jewish citizens of the United States inside the United States. They are pouring money into the lobby, and the lobby does the following. They walk into your office and say, you're a wonderful guy. We love you. If you'll vote this way on these issues, always ensuring that Israel gets everything that it wants whenever it wants it, then we will fund you as long as you want and keep you in office. On the other hand, if you refuse to do this, we're going to pour as much money as we can into whomever your opponent turns out to be and remove you from office. Oh, and by the way, if you have no objections, we're going to plant someone in the office here who represents our interests, who will keep us informed and keep you in line. That is how it works. Now, they have a lot of support because the people that own most of the social media organizations, the major media outlets, who are they? Well, they're contributors for the same reason. You've got to face reality. This is something that no one has been allowed to talk about for years. And Tucker, God bless him, was one of the first people to actually say, look, what are we dealing with here? And outed Cruz when he asked him about Iran. And it was perfectly obvious Cruz doesn't know anything about Iran. I can tell you, I don't think he knows anything about Ukraine or Russia or anything. It doesn't care. It doesn't matter. What matters is his reelection campaign, his donors, and the benefits that are extended to him, as well as senior officers in the military who retire, who are strong advocates for Israel, from New York financial firms that place you in places where you could become a millionaire. And that's what happens to the four stars who do the things that the Israel lobby thinks should be done. Now, this is not a new phenomenon. It's always been there, but not on the scale that it is now. Today, it's overwhelming.
So why are Israeli lobbying efforts more palatable in America than if Chinese lobbyists were to do the same thing, or some other wealthy country. I mean, Israel's a wealthy country, but it's a very small one. There's many countries who could probably attempt the same strategy, but it would not be nearly as palatable in America and would be outed and more politically controversial right away.
Well, first of all, most Americans don't know what I just described. They're not familiar with it. It's not something they're looking for. Contrary to popular belief, most Americans are not anti-Semitic. There is no great anti-Semitic threat in the United States. That's a lot of nonsense. Why would you suspect, instantaneously or instinctively, Jews who want to spend money to keep Israel afloat? Especially when you look at what's presented to the American public about Israel. I've been to Israel many times. I like the Israelis and I like the country. But they present Israel as this pristine, liberal democratic paradise surrounded in every direction by barbarians. That's very important to understand. And Israel is presented as the permanent victim of everyone around them and everyone in the world. And this is reinforced in many, many different ways. But you've got to once again go back to the diaspora and look at the enormous wealth that they control. And how much money does it really take to buy most people's goodwill? Not that many. No. And of course, they run these programs to Israel all the time to turn every congressman, every senator they can into a Zionist. And I've seen that many times. It works very well. You get a very narrow focus and a very limited perspective. But people are only there for a short time. They go back and then they say, I'm happy to take your money. And they take it and they like it. So that's what works. Somebody once said there's nothing more reliable than a man that can be bought with cold, hard cash.
Yeah, you're right. In your comments, how much money does it take to buy somebody's goodwill? Not that much. It struck me because, quite frankly, when you mentioned $1.8 million for Senator Ted Cruz, look, it's a lot of money. But also, I'm like, what's the house cost in Washington these days? Like, it's how much money is it to a guy like Ted Cruz, right? And it struck me as not very much, more than likely. But how much does it cost?
It also buys you access, because you've got to understand you have access now to a lot of people in a lot of major firms. Goldman Sachs, is a good example. There are dozens of them where you can now profit with what? Something we call insider information. That's one of the most widely played games in Washington that there is. How is it that so many congressmen show up as being worth maybe a couple of $100,000, and 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, they leave as millionaires? I mean, they're not being paid that much, frankly. In fact, I had more than one congressman tell me that one of the solutions is you forbid everybody to take any outside money, but you need to pay congressmen more than they're being paid now. I said, well, that's great. Who is going to vote that law into effect?
Yeah,
Congress
right,
is going to do that. Who's going to police Congress? This is why people say to me all the time, what do you think we need? And I keep bringing up Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell came along and said, enough. This country, his country, Great Britain, has to be governed by decent, honorable men. And he had a hell of a time because everybody was corrupt and had been corrupted for years. The parliament itself was of very little value to the British people. But he changed everything. And it didn't last forever, but most of it did endure. And Britain did become a modern country as a result of what he did. And George Washington modeled himself on Cromwell. He was Cromwell. People don't understand that about our history. So, and my point is this. This is a place, Washington, that looks like one thing and is ultimately another. It is riddled with all sorts of corruption, sexual, excesses of every imaginable kind. And the people vote not necessarily on a basis of conscience or commitment to any set of values. They vote against people and things they hate. They vote for things that involve their enrichment.
Let me ask you, just because this theory has been flying around, that, okay, how should I frame this? We talked about Israeli influence on United States policy and, how this is actioned. One theory that's flying around is that the leverage Israel has over Trump is directly related to the Epstein files. Elon Musk put out a tweet about this recently as well, that, the reason he's not releasing them is because he's in them. And the speculation from some journalists is that Epstein was always a Mossad agent.
I think the evidence for that is overwhelming.
Okay.
But it would be a mistake, though, to assume that the Mossad is unconnected to the CIA. And that's another problem. Right now, MI6, CIA, and Mossad are all very closely intertwined. So there's no doubt that the Epstein files are probably sitting somewhere in Israel as well as here. And they have things on all sorts of people that they willingly employ when they think it's useful to do so. And again, we say Israeli influence over the United States. Israel is not actively influencing us. It's the people in the lobby who support Israel. They are the agents for Israel. They're American citizens. And they're the ones driving the train. And they will set out to destroy anyone they can who stands in their way. There's an organization called Media Matters, led by someone named David Brock. And he is flush with cash every single day for the purpose of going out and destroying anybody who stands up to or opposes anything that the lobby wants. He's very much part of that plan. So I think, I don't know, how often President Trump visited Epstein Island. I have no idea. I haven't looked into it. I know that one of the senators who was very critical of me when I was nominated to go to Germany as the ambassador, and I was going through this vetting process, and this was Senator Menendez, who said all sorts of violent, terrible things about me, none of which were true. Turns out he was very much a frequent flyer on the Lolita Express, and fortunately now sits in jail finally, where he belongs for all sorts of criminality and misuse of funds and so forth. There are a lot of people like Menendez. They're not all as obvious or nasty and unpleasant, but there are large numbers up there. That's why when you go to testify, you speak, something like defense, for instance, they don't really care who manages things in defense as long as, number one, they keep the money flowing. Don't talk about cuts in defense spending. Don't talk about cutbacks in operations and troops anywhere. Never bring those things up. Don't talk about canceling any weapon systems. And then, by the way, pro-Israel. Do what Israel is in Israel's interest. You do those things. I don't care. You could be a 35-year-old deaf, dumb, and blind, and it wouldn't make any difference. That's what counts. And when you get to that point in government, you're in a lot of trouble. The republic is a facade. Americans are discovering with each passing day they're not represented. Now, there are Americans, I call them the Bombs Away Club. You tell them, well, we decided to bomb outer Slobovia, that we're annoyed with them and they've threatened us. We don't like them. Oh, sure, great. Bomb outer Slobovia. It's not everybody. I would say easily 2/3 of Americans do not feel that way. And there are a lot of people that voted for President Trump that are frankly surprised that he has frankly betrayed them and their trust. Because they did not vote for Israel first. They voted for America first. And I remember watching the Republican National Convention. And they had this giant Israeli flag all of a sudden on the wall, and above it said Israel first. And some gentleman walked out, I don't remember his name, and he tried to lead cheers for Israel first. And a lot of people in the audience sort of sat there like, what? What's this? Well, that was the message. That is where we are.
I mean, that was a core message from Ted Cruz in that interview when he talked about his mandate when he decided to run for the Senate. I have to press into one more thing here. When you say the evidence that supports Mossad's involvement with Epstein is impossible to ignore, imagine I've got no background, Colonel. What are some of the key threads that would substantiate that connection?
Well, you've got to You've got to sit down and go through a lot of the documentation that is available. You go on the internet, you'll come up with tons of material.
Okay.
That's not the problem. But what you need to understand is most of the people that you're dealing with on the Hill, I think that the CIA and Mossad together have a lot of information on them that is damning. And you can't run a government that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There are too many people that are too easily corrupted. And there are some people that have just made mistakes. But a mistake, depending upon what it looks like, can be presented as something so catastrophic that you never recover. The average American is not a deep thinker. I call Americans microwave thinkers, instant everything.
Sure.
Instant bombing, instant war, instant victory, instant withdrawal. Everything is quick, quick, quick. You show them there was a Senator Ben Cardin from Maryland was involved with 2 pages or staff members who were having homosexual sex with each other in a conference room in the Senate. And he apparently was present and took pictures of it. Well, in his case, he has nothing to worry about. The people in Maryland that voted him in will vote him in no matter what. But if you transferred that alleged event to another setting in another state, it could kill somebody forever, ruin them forever, even though it may or may not be true.
Yeah.
I mean, look at AI today. You can change things, alter things, present images and material that is damning, and you're finished overnight. You never recover. You never get your reputation back. Politics is hopelessly dirty and nasty now. And I simply think, the Mossad, the CIA, I'm sure MI6 in London, they've all learned to take advantage of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. Extortion is an ancient strategy because it works really well. My last question.
One last thing I want to say, the map of the Middle East and Central Asia, but particularly the Middle East, and the sort of constellation of power in the region is going to change profoundly now. And we are not going to remain the hegemonic power in the region. That's not going to work. And people say, well, how do you know that? I mean, we have so much power and we can do this and this. Well, they just shot down another F-35 this morning, flown by an Israeli pilot over Iran. The F-35, as an example, was billed as invincible, invulnerable, invisible. Nobody's shot down a B-2 yet. That doesn't mean it won't happen. Battleships used to be in the same category. Aircraft carriers used to be in the same category. Tanks, all sorts of things. Everything is impossible until it happens, I guess is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. We are at the end of this long period, 80 years since the end of the Second World War, where the United States has dominated everything. Bretton Woods, the financial institutions that emerged as a result of Bretton Woods, all of these things are going to change. They're going to change because the world is tired of us, because we've bullied everybody with our control of these institutions. And they don't want to be bullied. And we're going to see the proliferation of nuclear weapons, because everyone has learned the hard lesson that if you don't have a nuclear weapon, and the United States, whether it's American-induced, Israeli-induced, it doesn't matter, decides to go after you, you're going to go down. Remember one of the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu mentioned specifically. We want the Libya model applied to Iran.
Huh. Okay.
That's what he said in the Oval Office in front of the president. Think about that. What's Libya today? If nothing else, it's a catastrophe. Mm-hmm. Split down the middle in a permanent state of civil unrest, hostility, corruption, warfare. They have slave markets. Good God. And everybody had nothing good to say about Gaddafi. And Gaddafi finally agreed to open up all of his facilities, empty the country's chemical weapons, put them to bed, give up any nuclear capability, did everything he was asked to do. And what happened? They killed him. They destroyed his country.
Live on camera. Yeah. Yeah. Horrific video. You're right. Okay. Colonel, I know you got to run. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. I believe I'm going to see you in Vancouver again in January. You're coming back to our conference.
Well, that's up to you. Yeah.
It's a yes for me. That's for sure. Yeah.
This is good. Yeah. Well, I understand there's going to be a heat wave soon up in Canada. So when I come back, it'll be very warm and balmy.
Bring it on. Let's do it. All right. Thank you, Colonel. Have an excellent day. And thanks again.
Thank you, Jay.
A discovery doesn't matter unless it's economic. What's the difference between a discovery and a discovery that matters to us as investors? If you throw enough pressure and temperature and acid at a rock, you can get almost anything out. But if it costs you more than the metals are worth, you just don't do it. And this is where the metallurgical studies come in. This is the most exciting drill hole my grandmother has ever seen. That's a red flag. How to tell from Shinola? That's always the question for investors. My name is Lobo Tigre. I am the independent speculator in a phone book-sized feasibility study that if it's done well, you can take to a bank and they will give you hundreds of millions of dollars to build this mine. Understanding the geology is the beginning. It's funny how just something as basic as the rocks ultimately does inform my financial decisions and how I play it. The geology of that suggested it's still open in this direction, and so I was willing to bet on that, and that turned into something like a 20-bagger for us. And if you're going to suffer the headaches of exploring for and developing an asset, you might as well go for the big project that makes it worth having all those headaches.